A pirate crew drops anchor at some forgotten Caribbean island, and the first thing they do isn't look for treasure. They start digging holes in the sand and hauling metal pots ashore. They're making salt, extracting it straight from seawater with nothing but fire and sun. Salt kept pirates alive longer than any sword or cannon. Without it, meat rotted in days, fish spoiled in hours. Crews starved, surrounded by ocean they couldn't drink. And because pirates were outlaws, cut off from every legal port in the empire, they couldn't just buy salt. They had to rip it straight out of seawater using nothing but fire, sun, and days they didn't have to spare. This is how they did it. This is what it cost them. The ship slides into a protected cove somewhere in the Lesser Antilles. No towns, no merchants, just mangrove roots and white sand and water so clear you can see the bottom 20 feet down. The crew spills over the rails into longboats, hauling empty barrels, metal pots, shovels, anything that holds water. Fresh provisions last days in tropical heat. A stolen pig butchered this morning will be crawling with maggots by tomorrow afternoon. Fruit goes soft and splits. Fish stinks within hours. The only thing that stops the rot is salt, and salt is what they don't have. They can't sail into Port Royal or Havana and buy it. The moment they step into a colonial harbour, the Royal Navy strings them up. They're cut off. Every supply run is improvised. Every resource is stolen, scavenged, or made. So they anchor at islands like this one. Remote, no garrison, good sun. The crew hauls equipment ashore, looking for places to dig shallow pits and boil seawater until only the salt is left. Logistics, not adventure. The boring, exhausting work that keeps them from starving 3 weeks from now. Salt preserves meat through osmosis. Salt draws water out of bacterial cells, dehydrating them until they die. No moisture, no bacteria, no what? Pack meat in enough salt and it'll last months. Even in a sweltering ship's hold where temperatures hit 90 degrees and rats nest in the corners. Seawater contains roughly 3.5% salt by weight. That's enough to kill you if you drink it. Your kidneys can't process that much sodium, so they pull water from the rest of your body to flush the excess out. You get thirstier. You drink more seawater. Your kidneys work harder. Eventually, your organs shut down and you die more dehydrated than when you started. Seawater is poison, but seawater also contains the one substance that keeps food from rotting. The problem is separating the salt from the water and from the calcium, magnesium, and other minerals mixed in. Drink it and you're dead. Process it correctly and you survive. Pirates didn't have chemistry textbooks. They had experience passed down from sailors who'd been making salt for centuries, and they had two methods. Boil it fast and risk burning the ship down, or let the sun do the work and hope the weather holds. Some of the crew hauls metal pots and kettles onto the beach and starts building fires. They fill the pots with seawater, scooped straight from the surf, then set them over flames fed by driftwood and scraps of lumber they can't afford to waste. The water starts to heat. Bubbles form, steam rises, and the waiting begins. Boiling seawater behaves differently than boiling drinking water. As the water evaporates, dissolved minerals start to precipitate out in sequence based on their solubility. The first crystals to form are calcium and magnesium salts, the compounds that make seawater bitter and harsh. These crystals float on the surface or stick to the sides of the pot, and if you don't skim them off, your final salt will taste like battery acid. You scrape the scum away with a wooden paddle and keep boiling. Hours pass. The water level drops. The brine thickens. You stir constantly because if the salt settles and scorches to the bottom, the whole batch is ruined and you've wasted a day's worth of firewood. Your arms ache. Smoke burns your eyes. The fire has to stay hot enough to keep the boil going, which means feeding it constantly, which means someone has to keep hauling wood while you stir. Eventually the brine reaches the consistency of wet sand, thick, sludgy, studded with salt crystals but still damp. That's when you pull it off the fire and spread it out on flat surfaces to dry in the sun. You can't let it dry in the pot because the residual heat will bake it into a hard crust you'll have to chisel out. So you scoop the wet salt into shallow pans or onto sailcloth and leave it in the sun for another day or two until it's completely dry and can be stored. The whole process takes hours of labor for each batch. From 3 to 4 gallons of seawater, you get about 1 pound of salt. For a crew of 100 men, you need hundreds of pounds to preserve enough meat for a voyage lasting months. That means repeated batches, constant fires, endless stirring. And you can only do this on land, because keeping a fire hot enough to boil seawater aboard a wooden ship is asking to burn the vessel to the waterline. One spark in the wrong place, and the whole ship goes up. So boiling works when you're anchored safely ashore with time and fuel to burn. The other half of the crew doesn't bother with fires. They head down the beach with shovels and start digging. They're making solar evaporation pans, shallow depressions in the sand or clay that they'll flood with seawater and then let the sun do the rest. The process is simple. Dig a pit a few inches deep and as wide as you can manage. Wait for high tide and let seawater flow in or haul it up in buckets. Once the pit is full, block the entrance so no more water gets in. Now you wait. The Caribbean sun beats down at over 90 degrees. The steady trade winds blow across the surface of the water. Both accelerate evaporation. Water molecules escape into the air. Salt stays behind. Over the next several days, the water level drops. The salt concentration increases. When seawater reaches about 25 to 30% salinity, salt crystals begin to form and sink to the bottom of the pan. If conditions are ideal, hot sun, low humidity, steady wind, no rain, the process takes a week or two. If conditions are less than ideal, it takes longer. If it rains, the fresh water dilutes the brine and you start over. Solar evaporation is safer than boiling. No fire. No risk of torching the ship, no fuel consumption. But it's agonizingly slow and completely dependent on weather. A single afternoon rainstorm can ruin days of work, and while you're waiting for the sun to finish the job, you're stuck on this island, anchored, visible, vulnerable. Any passing naval patrol or rival crew could spot your sails and decide to investigate. You can't move until the salt is ready, and the salt won't be ready until the sun says so. Some islands are better for this than others. The Cape Verde Islands off the African coast had natural salt flats where seawater pooled and evaporated on its own. Ships would stop there to load salt that locals had harvested, but pirates couldn't rely on finding those spots. Most of the time they had to improvise, find a beach with the right kind of soil, dig the pits themselves, and hope the weather cooperated long enough to finish the job. Whether boiled or sun-dried, the harvest is the same. The crew scrapes salt crystals off the bottom of pans or out of pots, piles them up and lets them dry completely. The result is off-white, sometimes greyish, gritty with sand and sediment, bits of shell, traces of other minerals. Crude, unrefined, and it works. The scale of the operation becomes obvious when you do the math. Seawater is 3.5% salt. To get 1 pound of salt, you need to evaporate roughly 3 to 4 gallons of seawater. A pirate crew of 100 men needs to preserve meat for a voyage that might last 3 months. Salted meat requires about ½ pound of salt per pound of meat, and each man eats about a pound of meat per day when it's available. That's 4,500 pounds of meat over 3 months. Preserving that requires over 2,000 pounds of salt. Nobody's making 2,000 pounds of salt on one island stop, but they make enough to get by, enough to pack the fresh meat they've stolen or slaughtered, enough to preserve fish they've caught, enough to keep the crew fed until the next provisioning stop. A constant cycle. Use salt, run low, stop at an island, make more salt, move on. Every stop costs days. Every day anchored is a day exposed. The crew hauls the dried salt back to the ship in sacks or barrels. Heavy, coarse, and it gets everywhere, in your clothes, under your nails, grinding between your teeth when you eat. But it's done. They've turned seawater into the one substance that keeps them from starving. Back aboard the ship, the crew starts packing barrels. They take whatever meat they have, fresh killed pig, stolen beef, fish caught offshore, and begin the preservation process. Cut the meat into chunks. Layer it in the barrel with handfuls of salt between each layer. Pack it tight. Pour in a brine solution made from salt, dissolved in seawater until the meat is completely submerged. Seal the barrel. The salt goes to work immediately. Osmosis pulls moisture out of the meat, drawing water through the cell walls and leaving the tissue dry and leathery. Bacteria can't survive without moisture. The meat won't rot. It'll last months, maybe longer if the barrel stays sealed and the salt concentration stays high enough. But preserved doesn't mean edible in any normal sense. Salted meat is rock hard. Sailors called it salt horse because it had the texture of leather and the taste of pure sodium. Before you could eat it, you had to soak it in fresh water for hours to leach out some of the salt. Even after soaking, it remained overwhelmingly salty. Then you boiled it, which softened it slightly but didn't make it appetizing. The final product was chewy, tough, and so salty it made your mouth dry and your throat ache. Eating it required fresh water to wash it down, and fresh water was almost as scarce as the salt. Long-term consumption of heavily salted meat caused predictable problems. Extreme thirst in an environment where drinking water was rationed. Mouth ulcers from the constant salt exposure. Digestive misery. The human body processes that much sodium day after day for months with consequences. But the alternative was eating rotten meat or starving. And compared to those options, salt horse kept you breathing. Pirates also used salt for minor wound care. Salt water has antiseptic properties. The same osmotic effect that kills bacteria in meat works on bacteria in cuts and scrapes. Washing a wound with salt water or packing it with dry salt could help prevent infection. The downside was that it hurt. Salt in an open wound burns intensely, drawing fluid out of exposed tissue and triggering every pain receptor in the area. Historical accounts mention sailors being flogged and then dunked in barrels of seawater to complete the punishment. The salt made the pain worse. The ship leaves the island with barrels of salt stacked in the hold. The stop cost them a week, maybe two. A week of sitting exposed in a cove where any passing ship could spot them. A week of burning firewood they'll need for cooking and repairs. A week of labour, digging pits, boiling seawater, stirring pots, scraping salt, hauling barrels. A week they could have spent raiding or running or moving, but they had no choice. Without salt, the meat rots. Without preserved meat, they starve. And because pirates are outlaws, they can't sail into a port and buy what they need. Every colonial harbour has a garrison, a customs house, a list of wanted men. Pirates survive by stealing, scavenging, and improvising. Salt is one more thing they have to make themselves because the world has cut them off from legal supply chains. The crew will spend the next months eating salt horse. They'll suffer the thirst, the ulcers, the grinding misery of a diet dominated by preserved meat and hardtack. They'll ration water that tastes like the barrel it's been sitting in for 6 weeks. They'll deal with the health consequences of extreme sodium intake in a tropical climate where you're already sweating out electrolytes faster than you can replace them. And they'll do it because the alternative is worse. Starvation is worse. Scurvy is worse. Eating rotten meat and dying of food poisoning is worse. The salt keeps them alive, even if being alive means suffering in ways that would be unimaginable to anyone with access to refrigeration and grocery stores. Boiling seawater risked burning the ship down. Solar evaporation risked exposure and weather failure. Both methods required days of labor for relatively small amounts of salt. Both were brutal, inefficient, and necessary. Pirates extracted salt from seawater because they were desperate, isolated, and out of options. The ocean surrounded them with water they couldn't drink and food that spoiled in the heat. Salt was the only solution, and getting it required accepting risks and costs that would sink a less desperate crew. Salt extraction was survival math. The methods were simple in concept. Boil water, let the sun evaporate it, but execution required knowledge, patience, fuel, time, and a willingness to gamble that the weather would hold and no enemy would find you while you sat anchored and vulnerable. Pirates made that gamble because the alternative was starving 3 weeks out from land with no way to preserve the food they'd worked so hard to steal. They turned seawater into survival. They turned fire and sun into months of miserable, barely edible rations. They stayed alive by doing unglamorous, exhausting work that no one remembers when they talk about the golden age of piracy. There's something brutal about needing the ocean to survive when the ocean is trying to kill you. Every drop of seawater is poison. Every piece of fresh meat is a ticking clock. And the only thing standing between a pirate crew and starvation is days of back-breaking labor, turning one into the other, extracting the salt that preserves the food that keeps them alive long enough to do it all over again. The ships are gone now. The crews are bones. The islands where they anchored and dug their pits and boiled their seawater have been swallowed by resorts and charter boats. But for a few centuries, survival in the Caribbean meant understanding that simple doesn't mean easy. That fire and sun could save your life if you had the time and the desperation to make them work. That being free meant being cut off, and being cut off meant doing everything the hard way or dying. They extracted salt from seawater because no one else would give it to them. They ate salt horse because it was that or nothing. They accepted the thirst and the pain and the weeks of vulnerability because the ocean doesn't care about your choices. It just keeps offering you the same deal. Figure it out or starve.